Naturally, in this context, I was planning to say a few words about the filioque, which is the only official difference which leads to schism between Roman Catholic and Orthodox. But in view of the remarks of Metropolitan Job last night, it seems that there is some hope that Roman Catholics might not insist on conformity to the filioque, and in the hope that some Orthodox would not insist on its absence, I am not going to say any more about it because I don't think that it's a very deep difference. What instead I am going to do, which I was anyway going to do in 3/4 of my paper, I shall do in the whole paper, and that is to discuss a different, purported difference about the nature of the Trinity, which, although it is not recognized as a difference about an essential doctrine, would seem, if it existed, to be a deep theological difference. Modern expositions of the doctrine of the Trinity are often said to expound either a Latin theory, otherwise known as a unitary theory, or a Greek theory, otherwise known as a social theory. These names suggest that the two kinds of doctrine have their origin in differences between East and West in patristic and medieval times. I believe that to be a myth. Certainly by medieval times, theologians East and West agree on what is now called a deep theory. It was then, in my view, also a Latin theory, and I now begin to substantiate this claim by drawing attention to all the other aspects, apart from the filioque, on which there was a total agreement between East and West. First, all agreed that, as the Nicene Creed said, there is one God, Theos, or Deus in Latin, and also, as the Nicene Creed said or implied, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit, being beings clearly distinguishable from each other, were each God. Hence the apparent contradiction, which has led to anti-Christians claiming that Christianity has an obviously inconsistent essential doctrine. How can one thing also be three things? And many Christians claiming that the doctrine is too deep to be understood. However, there is a very easy way of resolving this apparent contradiction. This is that the words Deus and Theos can both be understood either as the name of a unique individual or as predicates, meaning divine, which can be predicated of more than one individual. Given that, the Creed can be interpreted as telling us that there is one individual, who consists of three distinct beings, each of whom is divine, and that is what makes them homoousioi. Now, at this stage, I'm going to expound what is on a handout under paragraph 1, and paragraph 1 will summarize what I am now going to say. Ousia is a notoriously ambiguous word in pre-Nicene Greek, but Christopher Stead, in his very thorough book, Divine Substance, argued that probably most of the bishops present at Nicaea would have understood ousia as the common abstract property possessed by different individuals. I will call it their essence. Hence its crucial doctrine that the three distinct beings of the Trinity are homoousioi is to be read that they each have the same one essential property as each other, which I will call the property of divinity. However, ousia was translated into Latin as essentia, natura, subsistentia, or substantia. And so the three beings came to be referred to as, in Greek, hypostases or prosopoi, and in Latin as subsistentiae, supposita, or personae. Hypostasis, substantia, and supposita are general terms which apply to beings other than personal ones, while prosopa and personae are species of the former, applying to persons. But the Latin substantia is crucially ambiguous. It can refer to either an individual being or to what I have called an essence of an individual being. And the earliest known Latin translations of the Creed translated homoousioi as homoousion patri, hoc est eiustai dem substantiae patri. Aware of these differences, the 5th century Christian philosopher Boethius classically defined a persona as an individual substance, substantia, of a rational nature. And he adds that by this definition, we Latins have described what the Greeks call hypostasis. A hypostasis, Boethius claims, is what underlies and supports properties, and is best translated into Latin as substantia, an individual being, not as a genus or species. All the Latin medievals, including Aquinas, seem to have accepted Boethius's definition as giving a necessary condition for something being a person. While Latins accepted that there are 3 individual substances in the sense in which the Greeks were using that term, which they called hyposita or subsistantiae, they were reluctant to say that there were 3 substantiae. But Aquinas' reason for being reluctant to say this it was simply, as he says, that substantia was often used to mean natura, that is, in the same sense as essentia, and Latin and Greeks all denied that there were 3 different essences in God. Hence, there was only one essence which each of the members of the Trinity had in its entirety. The trouble being caused by the different understandings of substantiae in Latin. The second respect in which all Latins and Greeks agreed was that each of the members of the Trinity have the same essence in the sense of the same essential properties. They both mean by a property an intrinsic property, that is, one which can be possessed by a substance independently of its relations to any other substances. And they did not include as a property what most contemporary philosophers today call relational properties. That is, properties that relate 2 or more substances to each other as properties. Being square is an intrinsic property. A substance can be square independently of how it is related to other substances. Being taller than John is a relational property which relates its possessor to John. I've now finished on A. I'll come to B in a moment. Being taller than John is a relational property which relates its possessor to John. An essential property of a thing is a property which it must have in order to exist. Thus, occupying space is an essential property of my desk. So, to repeat, it was agreed that each of the persons has the same essential intrinsic properties, all of which together constitute the essence, and that is what makes them divine. For example, John of Damascus wrote, "Ousia signifies the common and general form, such as God, man, while hypostasis marks the individual, that is to say, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, or Peter and Paul." But at this stage, it might seem that the Western tradition began to diverge from the Eastern tradition, it might seem. For the Fourth Lateran Council of 1215 AD, rejecting the supposed view of Joachim of Fiore, that the unity of the Godhead is a collective unity, open quote, in the way that many persons are said to be one people and many faithful one church. On the contrary, Lateran IV declared it to be a Catholic doctrine that there exists a certain supreme reality, res, that is to say, substance, essence, or divine nature, which truly is the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. That is to say, it's contrasting it with the situation of Peter and Paul, or it seems to be, who are have the same abstract properties but are distinct individuals. It is suggesting that the unity of Father, Son, and Spirit is more than them having the same abstract property. However, it also said in an earlier paragraph that the Trinity is undivided according to its common essence, but distinct according to the properties of its persons. So it allows that the persons have distinct properties, but share a common essence. So what is it saying more than what John of Damascus said? Now, at this stage, I refer you to B on my handout. What has caused the confusion is that many medieval Western theologians had come to understand essentia, or natura, differently from the Eastern ones. For Easterners, as also I suggest probably did most of the bishops of Nicaea, ousia was simply an abstract universal. That is to say, being an embodied animal is the essentia, a rational animal, is the essentia of humans, would be just to say that to be human is to be an embodied rational animal. But for many medieval Western theologians, the essentia of a thing was not this abstract property, but a concrete thing, constituted by all the things of the abstract kind, parts of this concrete thing being found in every place where there was anything of that kind. That is to say, the concrete essence of humanity consisted of all humans, and it was present where each human existed. Part of the essence was present where Peter existed, and part of the essence was present where Paul existed. But of course, each of the members of the Trinity do not occupy places, and so the essence of divinity is not spread among different places. Hence, the concrete essence of the Father, Son, and Spirit was different from the concrete essence of the Peter and Paul in the sense that it was not spread around. In the case of Father, Son, and Spirit, it was in the same place, that is to say, everywhere. But as Eastern theologians were going to deny that the difference in this application of a category, no Eastern theologian was going to deny that this difference in the application of a category, concrete, universal, which they did not use. It was just that they didn't use this category, and therefore they said the essence is the same in Father, Son, and Holy Spirit as it is in Peter and Paul. That is to say, a necessary condition for being that individual. John of Damascus wrote, quote, Peter and Paul do not dwell in one another and are separated. We recognize by the species that they have a common relation. So Lateran IV was not adopting a theological position on which East and West disagree. It was simply in saying that if you use the category of concrete individuals, there's a difference between the situation of Peter and Paul and the situation of Father, Son, and Spirit. But if you use the category of abstract individuals, the point is the same. That is to say, in both cases, it is a necessary condition for being that individual that you have a common abstract property. The second agreed matter is that the persons differ essentially from each other only in their relations of origin and in no other respect. They have the same essential properties, but relations weren't being counted as properties, and so they differ from each other in their relations of origin and in no other respects. Thus, Boethius again, the manyness of the Trinity is expressed by the category of relation. Only terms belonging to relation may be applied singly to each member of the Trinity. The Father was the cause of the existence of the other two, who are distinguished by the Son being begotten from the Father and the Spirit proceeding from the Father. But this is compatible with three different views, amended whether or not according to whether you take the filioque or not. This is compatible with three different views about what the relations are. The first view is that they are simply relations of causation. The difference between the persons is that the Father is the person who is the sole cause of the Son, and the Father and the Son, or the Father through the Son, are the cause of the Spirit. And of course, this view can only be held by those who adopt the filioque. The second view, which can be held only by those who deny the filioque, is that each of the Son and Spirit were caused by the Father alone, and so begetting must be a different relation from spirating. That is, a different relation from merely causing to proceed. The third view, which I find in both Eastern and Western theologians, combined the other two views. It held that the Son and the Spirit differed from each other, both in virtue of their different causal relations to the Father and because of the causal relations themselves were of different kinds. Because the simplicity of a theory is evidence of its truth, and because all patristic and medieval theologians wanted to say that God is a simple being, I suggest that the first view, that they are only to be distinguished by their causal relations, is more probably the true one. But what none of the fathers would advocate is that the Son and the Spirit differ from each other in virtue of any intrinsic properties. They only differ from each other in virtue of their relations, which may be just relations of causation, or they may be some more complicated relation. But that can be the only difference. Because all patristic and medieval theologians agreed that the persons were distinct only in virtue of their different relations to each other, it follows that any person who had the property of divinity and a particular relational property would be that person. There couldn't be more than one person who had a property of divinity and the same relation to the Father. Finally, all patristic and medieval thinkers agree all the actions of each member of the Trinity are actions of the whole Trinity, except for the characteristic acts, which are the acts by which one member causes another member. Omnia acta Trinitatis ad extra indivisa sunt. All the outward directed acts of the Trinity are indivisible. That is, each such act is one united act of the whole Trinity. As Gregory Palamas wrote, referring to their outward directed acts, the three different hypostases mutually co-inhere and interpenetrate naturally, totally, eternally, inseparably, and yet without mingling or confusion, so that their energy is also one. The characteristic acts, however, of begetting the Son and spirating the Spirit are not, as Aquinas puts it, acts of will, in the sense of being the source of effects which can be one way or the other. Rather, they are acts of nature, acts of essence. That is to say, it follows from the nature of the Father, or whoever, that is, that he will beget or spirate. He has no free choice about whether to beget or spirate. He only does it willingly in the sense that he is glad to go along with it. It is because the intrinsic properties of the persons are the same, whether understood as abstract or as concrete universals, and because the persons dwell in each other, as John of Damascus concluded, that thereby we recognize the indivisibility and the unity of God. For verily there is one God, and his word and spirit. And Aquinas wrote that the explanation of why we say there is but one God is that there is one divine essence in three persons. So, with these specifications, I find in Western medieval thought the same social theory of the Trinity as in Eastern thought, the theory of three persons in the sense of distinct centers of knowledge, love, will, and action. And this has been contrasted in modern times with a Latin theory, which seems to be a theory of God being one individual thing, and so one substantia in that sense of an individual thing with three different properties, differing from Sabellianism only in claiming that these different properties are not merely different manifestations to humans, but different essential properties of that substance. Barth and Rana are in this sense Latin theorists. And why Latin? Obviously because they find such a theory in the middle chapters of Augustine's De Trinitate, where he offers the model of the mind's love of itself, and the mind's knowledge of itself, and the model of the mind's memory, understanding, and will. These are not models of a social theory. Rather, they are all models of one individual thing and its necessary properties. But Augustine himself rejected these analogies as totally inadequate in chapter 15 of De Trinitate, on the grounds that each of the persons of the Trinity has love, understanding, etc., quite apart from their relation to the other members. Who, Augustine wrote, would dare to say that the Father understands neither himself nor the Son nor the Spirit except by the Son, or loves them except by the Spirit? Augustine, unlike his medieval successors, does not seem to me to have a clear theory of the Trinity, but the proliferation of the Latin translation of the Creed, in which homoousion is translated as eiustem substantiae, would have encouraged the view, which they found in the middle chapters of Augustine among later theologians, that Father and Son were in some sense properties of one substantia in the same sense of one individual being. Richard of St. Victor, a paradigm advocate of the social theory in the West, gave for the first time an a priori argument for its truth, claiming that it followed from the existence of one divine being that necessarily he will cause the existence of two and only two other such persons. Augustine had argued that the perfect goodness of the Father would lead to his causing the existence of a Son equal in power and goodness to himself. Richard of St. Victor took the argument further by arguing that perfect love of someone involves ensuring that they have some person who can love them and be loved by them, and that the perfect love of the members of the Trinity would involve each of them being equal in power and goodness. I fully agree with this argument for there being three divine persons. Indeed, it's one of the it's an intuition that comes from reflecting that there is something rather sad about a marriage which doesn't give rise to a child who can be loved and beloved by the other member, the other spouse. But it seems to me that Richard did not provide an adequate explanation of why there can only be three divine persons. My explanation of why there can be only three divine persons is that it would be good to bring about if it would be good to bring about a fourth divine person, it would also be good to bring about a fifth divine person, and so on ad infinitum. Omnipotent persons cannot do the logically impossible, and so would still be perfectly good whatever number of such persons they created. Hence, their perfect goodness and mutual love did not require them to cause a fourth divine person. But in that case, causing a fourth divine person would require an act of will by the Father or other divine person, rather than an act of essence. Yet no person brought about by an act of will would exist as necessarily as the first three persons do, and so that further person could not have the divine essence. It follows that necessarily, if there is one first divine person who is perfectly good and omnipotent, there will be three and only three divine persons. Thank you.